Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Riverdale Season 7, Episode 8. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I had been wondering for a while. I was like, okay, we haven't seen Reggie. I was like, is he in this season? But I looked, I was like, no, he's on the season poster. So I was like, where is he? Well, I wasn't expecting him to pop up in the show in this regard, but there's a lot of interesting elements about this episode, especially with Reggie's introduction. Well, first and foremost, turned out he went to Stonewall Prep, and we saw a familiar face amongst the Stonewall Preps just for a little bit, but obviously showing that Stonewall Prep is still filled with the douchebags it's always been filled with. And that should come as no surprise, but obviously the Bulldogs haven't been doing great, and their legacy's kind of getting tarnished, so Frank ends up bringing new blood onto the team, and that's Reggie. Reggie ended up dropping out of high school because of everything he had to deal with at Stonewall Prep. And so, interesting enough, he kind of plays a little bit of a Jughead role, which, I mean, like, interestingly, it's one of those dynamics where it's like, you don't see certain characters, like, hang out as much. Like, Jughead and Archie aren't around each other that much this season, so it's interesting that Reggie's kind of almost filling that void to some extent, where it's just like, hey, Reggie's staying at Archie's place, which obviously is very much him and Jughead, and they kind of come from similar worlds, but also different worlds, so it's so interesting the parallels they're kind of creating in that regard. It does feel like Reggie's kind of being set up as Archie's bestie, which they've always been, like, frenemies. They've always had, like, a friendship that was also, like, a rivalry. Like, they've always had that. So it's interesting to see, like, feels like they're going to become, like, best buds in this particular world. Like, obviously, there was always, like, the Veronica angle that eventually became, like, a wrinkle in that particular friendship and kind of leaned more towards the rivalry. But either way. But wait, let me go ahead and talk about that. That plays out even interestingly enough, too, because it's so funny because Veronica and him, like, their dynamic is completely switched. Because I'd make the argument that Reggie was the one that was always kind of chasing after Veronica. It was actually very mutual. It was kind of a mutual thing, whereas this time around, like, Veronica's kind of, like, chasing after him, but he kind of has no interest. In fact, it seemed like he was kind of interested in Betty, but that kind of died off, which I was about to say, like, well, are we about to flip this? So instead of Archie and instead of Veronica kind of being the thing between Archie and Reggie, it's actually going to be Betty, which obviously is going to complicate things because, like, she likes Archie, but then, like, Archie likes Betty, but then, like, she's liking Reggie, but Reggie likes Betty, so I don't know how complicated that's going to turn up. I don't even know if, like, that's going to continue or not, but it seemed like Reggie did kind of like Betty. I mean, it's kind of, like, fascinated by her, but I guess the moment he heard about, like, what she got in trouble for, I guess two things. One, he's like, oh, I see, like, you and Archie have something going on. But she's like, no, it's not like that. But it's like, I think he could already read the tea in the leaves. And he's like, I think Reggie didn't want to come to Riverdale and, like, it's just like, I want to keep my head low. I want to do what I got to do. I'll play on the team. I'm trying to get, like, into a really good college. And if I can get into a really good college, things will kind of be said, especially considering his family's kind of struggling for money. That's why he also dropped out for school. It's like he was already dealing with what he had to deal with. Plus, his dad came home from the army. He's got shrapnel, so, like, he can't really, like, do what he needs to, and that plays into Reggie present. Like, everything, especially last season, everything Reggie did was for his dad because he took over his dad's business. So it's like it's very kind of replicated in that regard. I hope they don't have the same relationship they did because, as we know, Reggie's dad was abusive, and not that they worked past it, but they were able to heal and they were able to find their way forward despite all of that. So I don't know if, hopefully Reggie and his dad aren't in that same boat. Hopefully, like, things are good where it's like, no, his dad wasn't abusive. But I could definitely see it being an issue because of everything his dad probably has to deal with, because yes, his mom's from Korea, but his dad was born here. I don't know if that's supposed to, like, indicate, like, okay, his mom is Korean, but his dad isn't, so maybe he has a different dad in his world, or just being like my mom, they're both Korean, but my dad grew up here, he was born here in the U.S., whereas my mom was straight up born in Korea, so I don't know if maybe he talked about his mom beyond that. I don't know if because that's the thing, like, Reggie's mom, like, present day is, like, had died, so I don't know if, like, that's probably reflected in this as well. Like it's just him and his dad. But the reason why I was saying like maybe history could still repeat itself of like it has an abusive dad just because of the way he gets treated being Korean, so I can only assume his dad gets treated bad, and that is a sad thing of like abuse can like, hey, when you get abused, you want to take it out on other people, but Reggie hasn't replicated that, but he was kind of a bully himself, but he's also like not like that at all. He just wants to keep his head down, like, hey, I got to do what I got to do. In fact, he sticks up against bullies, you know. But anyway, I'll circle back to it. But like I said, it makes me wonder if all of that stuff like made him go like, yo, I don't want trouble with Betty because that's going to draw too much attention, and I want to avoid anything that can draw too much attention. That might be also why he wants nothing to do with Veronica, because she's too much of a like, oh, like there's too much attention. Like Veronica kind of has that kind of like, she stands out too much, and the last thing you want to do is get involved with someone who stands out too much. You want to be super low key. But yeah, I mean, and I think this is playing into like Archie's growth as well, Reggie's appearance, because just like everything between like, you know, it's like, hey, he wants to hang out with Kevin and Clay, like how that shifted and changed his view. Same thing with Reggie, where it's like, especially when he's like, oh, your family's not being well compensated for like your dad's time in the military. Why is that not? Like, he's like, my family is because of my dad's service. He's like, why do you think? And it's just kind of that thing of like that, you know, that ugliness of like, oh, because you're Korean, like you're not getting what your family is essentially owed. So that's why he works on the farm. And obviously going out there on the basketball court, he kills it. But Julian making a point, because he is who he is. Once again, Cheryl has it to some extent. Once again, it's still there. It's always been a part of Cheryl to some extent. Obviously, it got lessened and lessened because, especially in high school, because she was the queen bee. Like she had, and as a blossom, that did go to her head. She had a very, very inflated ego. But Julian has it the worst. Like, it's still there with Cheryl, but she's becoming more and more of a better person. Julian continues to be a dickbag, and maybe, just maybe, he'll be able to turn things around. But we'll have to wait and see. But at the very least, when it comes to this situation, he wanted to prove himself as top dog. And so they put together a team. It's everyone against, because like Fangs, Archie, and Reggie on one side, and they bring in Doily, who, you know, luckily he gets the final like basket, which is pretty dope, you know? Because at first I was looking at it, I was like, are they the only minorities on the team? It seems like that's not the case, but it is that thing of, because Fangs is kind of an outsider, but he's like well accepted in his team because he's him. He doesn't care. He's who he is, so he doesn't like get swept up in that. Because even Julian doesn't treat him the same way he because I think it's like minorities is one thing. Yes, the school is integrated, but like as a Korean kid, like you're even more like as an Asian kid, you're even more separate because you're even more of a minority than even the minorities, because you know a lot of the country's probably like, you know, there's a large enough black population. We don't know what the Hispanic population is like in the U.S. at this particular time, but like I'm sure the Asian population is even lower. I mean, obviously this is also like maybe not like low, but still low enough, because obviously this isn't. I mean, it's 20 years, but that's still only 20 years after like World War II and just how this country treated Asians in general, but obviously the Japanese Americans in particular. So, but either way, it didn't do them any good. The fact is that Reggie's team ended up serving up Julian. It's like, right, it was the four of them against the rest of the team, and they still ended up coming out on top. And Archie's like, yo, let's go for burgers, but Reggie doesn't want to. But Julian's like, nah, come on out. But it's not until, because like every time Archie tries to extend an olive branch, like Reggie's kind of like, nah, I'm good. And later on, he talks about it with Archie, because he's like, I don't know if you're just that naive, but you aren't listening to me. I don't want anything to do with anybody, because he's like, Stonewall Prep, they literally filled my locker with rice. It's like, holy shit, is that racist? And Home Dude even said, quote, yellow. I was like, fuck, dude. I mean, once again, it is that thing of like, oh man, the 50s and 60s, they were singing, it's like, oh, this swinging time. It's like, Yeah, but yeah, it's only an awesome time if you're white. Once again, it's one of those things of like, yeah, history has that ugliness to it where you're just kind of like, it kind of I don't know, because of everything else, you kind of forget like what time frame it is. I mean, not really, because the show does remind you, like, like Cheryl and Tony's circumstances, or Kevin and Clay, like, kind of have to keep that low key because that's super not accepted at this time. So there's reminders, but it's just like, jeez. And it's just the thing of Archie has kind of led a naive enough life because he's the all-American kid, and he believes, like, no, like, it can't be like that, right? Like, especially because I think the Emmett Till thing was probably like a big eye-opening thing for not only him, a lot of people in Riverdale, specifically at Riverdale High, especially at such young ages where your mind is being molded and everything. But for him, it was just kind of like, no, we're not like that here. And he goes to that little mixer that the Blossoms are holding, and the way they talk about Reggie is the same way slave owners would talk about their slaves, of like, yeah, you're a good hard worker, like you're a mule. That's all they saw you as. Like, that's what they see Reggie as, of like, like he's our beast on the court. Outside of that, who cares? All he has to do is stand there and smile. I mean, who cares about him and his family or whatever goals he has in mind? And Archie's standing there listening to this disgusting talk and just like, Reggie's a good dude. They're like, oh my God, the sacrifice you have to be making, Archie, to have to stay in the same house as him. It's just like, for him, it's like, he knew the Blobsons were an issue because obviously he sees how much of a tool Julian is. But in that moment, it's just like, you guys are even more disgusting. Like, you don't see Reggie as a human. You see him as like an object. The means of like, making the team better. And once again, even then, it's just like, I think also his Uncle Frank not saying anything too, but it's like, right, this is your number one sponsor for the team. It's like, just like with Hal and Alice's station or whatever is heavily sponsored by the Blossom, so it's not like you can really do or say much in that regard. So, but ultimately, when it came to the ball game the next day, they were like boxing him out, and he made some remark about Reggie, and Archie just came up and knocked him down. And he's like, this is some BS. You don't have to like Reggie. Well, fine, but here on this court, we are in this together. We rise together. We fall together. Reggie is our star athlete here. We have to rise to his level. I won't be a part of some BS like that. If you can't like click and be good with Reggie, like, because on this court you want to have an issue with him outside, whatever, but here on this court we are in this together. We are a team, and if you have a problem, there's the door. And he even talked to Julian and helped him up. It's like, hopefully that smacked some sense into him. But even later on, he's telling Reggie, he's like, I didn't do that for you or whatever, but for him it's like, it's because he's like, I did it for me, I did it for the team. But it's also because he's like, maybe I also did it because I didn't want to believe you when you said, like, our town could be like that. But he's like, our town is just as messed up as any, And for him, that's what really, like, irked his nerves. But I think for Reggie, it speaks volumes that you were willing to go out of your way for them. So it's like, fine, let's go to Pops. Don't expect me to, like, to sit with anyone or anything. So, So I think that's going to be a nice, like, I think their friendship is going to be a little bit different this time around. But to be fair, once again, we still don't fully know where the Betty situation sits in that regard. So, which, speaking of Betty, she was forced to join the Vixens because it's like, I got to work off some of that energy. So, yeah, that's why I was wondering if something was kind of building between them, but nothing ended up happening. So, I'm curious to see what that ends up turning out to be going forward. But also, it's just like going back to it, because even Archie made a point of like, I know I didn't have to stand up for you, but I didn't do that for you. I was like, yeah, because some people be like, oh, like here comes Archie the White Knight. It's like, I mean, it's not like him capping or anything or caping. It is legitimately who Archie is. Like, yes, he's had his confusion. He's had his, like, struggles with figuring out who he is and what he wants to be. But Archie has always been a good dude. He's made some mistakes here and there, but it's part of growing. He just wants to try and do the right thing. And that's just Archie just being a good dude. And I do love that. That's reflected in this time frame, too. That despite it all, a lot of these characters, despite their circumstances, are still somewhat because even Julian, it's like, well, let's not forget, Jason was a douchebag, but it wasn't until like the whole him and Polly thing that things really start changing. He became a different person, but he never was around long enough for us to really get to embrace the new Jason he was becoming. So it's just, but it's like everyone is at some level at their core who we've come to know them as over the course of this series, just kind of like a slightly modified version of them, because it is that conversation of nature, who they are at the core versus nurture, the environment that they're in, and you know, the backdrop of like the time period and all of that plays a role. And you know, it's a combination of who you are at your core rising above, you know, the backdrop of the circumstances and time frame you're in. So, which, speaking of the time frame, Tabitha has come back to school, and she had asked Tony like, "Oh, are you writing anymore?" And Tony had kind of like that had fallen to the wayside because Tony's kind of gotten preoccupied with other stuff, and more recently the Vixens and being a cheerleader. But she's not really vibing with it, especially after what Lizzo said. Like, well, to be fair, it started with Cheryl being like, "Oh, we should go steady," which obviously for Tony it's like, "Oh, that's kind of very square," like labeling it like that, because for Tony it's like, hey, it's just supposed to be fun. But I also feel like, oh, that's kind of messed up. You kind of been like making a point to kind of go after Cheryl, and now you guys are together, her being like, "Oh, you guys going steady." I was like, oh, is that going to kind of scare you away? Like, do you have like, is this kind of like a commitment thing? And it's like, it's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of many different things, because what Lizzo was like, oh, there you go, I get it. Like, hey, because you can tell like Lizzo really, really likes Tony, but like Tony doesn't. I guess it's kind of like they kind of have their fling or whatever. But like Lizzo, because she seemed like okay with like whatever happening between Cheryl and her being a fling. Like, it's like, oh yeah, like get with someone that you can never have to fully commit yourself to, that it can be a fun thing that never has to get serious. And it's like, I guess Tony had never really fully thought of it like, oh, is that the only reason why I did, like, I only joined the Vixens? I went out of my way for this thing because of like the back and forth between me and Cheryl, and now that we're together, it's like, I don't want us to be like together. It's fun, but it's for her, it's like there's too much of a vast difference. Because it is the thing of, we come from different backgrounds. Not only are you white, you're also a blossom. That's a whole category in itself, just being a blossom. And it's like we come from two different worlds, and it's just that the gap between them is too big. Which obviously she's talking to Tabitha and Clay about that, which Tabitha and, you know, Jughead are, you know, heading in a direction, but also Kevin and Clay. It's like, yeah, like he's like, we talk about things, like, you know, it's a conversation back and forth, but they're managing to make it work. And he's like, or, you know, but Tony would kind of felt like, what, end it now, because things between me and Cheryl, like, it'd be too hard, and it would never work out. It's impossible, but nothing's impossible. And Clay's like, you know, especially if you like the person enough. And I think for Cheryl, you know, talking to her later, being like, oh, is me being white one of the main reasons why we broke up? And it plays a part. But despite all that, Cheryl does care about Tony. So when Tony's like, hey, me and the others are making a club, kind of a black writing society, so we can talk about the type of writing that we want to, especially when Featherby wouldn't publish her paper on Emmett Till, her poem on Emmett Till. No, it was like she wanted to print something for the Blue and Gold about Emmett Till, but he wouldn't let her. So they want to be able to make something on their own, and Cheryl is willing to help them out, even to the point there was funding that we don't know what that funding was towards. Maybe it's like money that was supposed to go to Cheryl, but Cheryl wanted to help out Tony, especially because she overheard everything about the way they were talking about, her family was talking about Reggie, that I think for her that probably like cemented, like, right, like I can understand like why Tony would have her reservations when it comes to me, like considering my family, not only just the white thing, but even the Blossoms, about being white and the Blossoms, like that talk cuts even deeper. So also, there was kind of a little bit of an awkward thing of, oh yeah, like every member of the Vixens have to like kind of like have someone's jersey and kind of bake them cookies or whatever. And Tony got signed up with Archie, which is so interesting because it's like, oh, that was kind of like your boyfriend for a little while, so getting your girlfriend to like be that connected to your boyfriend, your ex, is kind of interesting. Which I love the Mitch and Fang situation. I love that even at the mixer, like Mitch is just standing there and Fangs is kind of nearby, and like Cheryl walks by and sees it, and she's just like ugh, sighs, rolls her eyes, and grabs Mitch. Like, you're not just going to stand here and look at your boyfriend. Obviously, because the word still hasn't gotten. Obviously, they've kept that tight lip, but still, no one knows about her being pregnant. So, but ultimately, all of the stuff that's come up so far got Tony thinking, and she's willing to talk to Cheryl and figure out, talk about, if they want to, if they tried, it being a them situation again. Because isn't their ship named Choni? Isn't that their ship name? I could be wrong. I swear it's Choni, but maybe it's something else. Either way, circling back to the Kevin situation, him getting a job at the Babylonian, which is interesting. Also, like also tying this into like the Veronica. I was like, yo, Veronica going like harder to paint after Reggie. I was like, hey, yo, like that's just so interesting. Like I said, he kind of like has no interest in her at all, and so she hires Kevin because she's trying to get close to Clay. I was like, well, like, Veronica's playing the field and stuff like that, trying to find love and stuff. And so she wants to kind of have Kevin be her wingman to get close to Clay to kind of figure out, like, oh, is he dating anyone? Which is awkward because we know Kevin and Clay have a thing. We don't know if they've officially, like, labeled it or whatnot. But Veronica's attempts are kind of just met with, like, cold water in a metaphorical sense when it came from Clay. And ultimately, Kevin's like, right, Clay isn't interested in you. Assertive women at all, and neither am I. And she's like, I knew it. I was like, wait, were you screwing with him the entire time? I was like, no, she was just testing her hypothesis, because it's like, yeah, the things you guys, like, yeah, I had a feeling, but it's like, nah, she's like totally and perfectly fine with that. I love that she still tried to be like, I mean, is there a chance that Clay might also like girls too? And Kevin's like, no, and neither do I. And she's like, okay, just making sure. I'm like, are you trying to swing a menage a trois? Really, Veronica? I love it. But she said something really interesting where she was like, right, I have an easier time hanging around Tony and Tabitha and not like a Steve and Dennis. And it's like, who? It's like, oh, Steve McQueen and Dennis Hopper. Was like, you and these name drops. But it's like for her, for the first time, this town is starting to feel a lot like home. And I think for Kevin, it's nice to be able to be open with another person because, well, him and Betty, he's open with Betty. She knows his circumstances. Obviously, Tony knows, and so does Cheryl, but they haven't really connected in that regard. At least, I mean, Tony and obviously Kevin most likely because obviously the darkroom element, but we don't know if like Cheryl and Kevin have. But it's like nice camaraderie to know like, hey, there's someone else at school that that is, in a similar boat as you. So I think it must be nice to be friends with someone else like that. But I'd almost like, the fact is that going back to what Veronica said, I was like, that's interesting. So part of me was wondering, is I implying like she has an easier time having female friends and gay male friends, but straight male friends is kind of like a rocky and complicated thing for her? I wonder, it felt like that's what she was implying, but maybe I was reading too much into that. Maybe it's because like, she's grown up around so many like big time stars that are straight, so maybe that's what that plays into. But either way, I love when Reggie shows up and she's like, oh, did you come here just for the movies or because you remembered that I was here? He's like, actually, I completely forgot you worked here. She's like, I don't work here. I own this place. He's like, cool, can I get a popcorn? She's like, oh, it's on the house. And obviously it's like, wow. Kevin's like, that's so rude, but hey, there's plenty of fish in the water. But for her, it's like, nah, that's definitely the Moby Dick I'm after. Because it's like, it's that thing of the more you don't want me, the more I want you type of situation. And you want what you can't have type of thing. And that kind of plays a little into Veronica's personality, especially in this time frame and, who she is right now. So I just thought that was kind of funny. So I'm interested to see where things kind of go on that front, whether there ends up being any headway on Veronica's side of things. And then finally we had the whole Tabitha and Jughead thing, because it's like, oh, Jughead was supposed to help her, like, sit with her homework while she was on tour with Emmett Till's mom, which Jughead's like, oh yeah, I completely forgot about it. It's like, well, to be fair, you were a completely different Jughead at the time that happened, so... But it's like, it's funny how everything does work out, because it's like hey, that's coming, that's circling back around. So that's why I was like, yeah, these final relationships are going to definitely be interesting, especially in this regard. I mean, because like some stuff is like obviously we're setting up a Jughead and Tabitha situation, so them, going to the movies together. I even love him ordering all that stuff, and I was like, you're just ordering that for yourself, aren't you? And he's like, you want anything? And she's like, no, I'm good. I was like, I mean, to be fair, that's the Jughead's character, like the big, the bottomless stomach. And I loved also like those pricing should be like, and she's like, oh, that'd be 75 cents. You're like, Jesus. All that, but I mean, 75 cent back then is very different than what it would be this day. Obviously, just because massive amounts of inflation in between now and then, so it's you can't fully equate it to like, oh, 75 cent isn't like 75 cents then isn't the same thing as like 75 cents now. So it's not like fully comparable, but it's still just a thing of geez, because obviously that in comparison, that's probably still like, even though it's like change, it's still probably like a lot for that time frame. I don't know. Either way, even the fact is that she like introduces like one of her favorite authors to Jughead, and it's like, oh, yeah, you want to read this? And she's like, yeah, it's this story about, and she's like, oh, a comet, which I'm like, that has to, I mean, that's probably a real story, but it has to also be like, yeah, that was done on purpose. Of like, yeah, there are only 2 survivors in it, which are like, well, which plays into, hey, the only ones who knew what was going on is the guardian angel Tabitha of Riverdale and Jughead, who still managed to have all his memories of everything. So it's almost interesting, and it's like, yeah, it's like the first like depicted interracial relationship in a book and stuff. So it's like, oh, we could read it together, and I was like, oh, look, that's so sweet. Jughead had stopped by Radberry's place beforehand because he wanted to introduce Tabitha to him, but I thought like Jughead would have checked the door. Like, I mean, it probably would have been unlocked, but it's like, yeah, going into someone's place without their permission kind of already stole from him, when you took one of his scripts. So it's like, I'm not about to do that. So ultimately, Jughead stops by later on and finds Sheriff Killer already there. So I was like, okay, because I was about to say, I was like, his note on the door isn't there. And it's like, well, because the cops already arrived. I guess like no one had heard from him for a while, so they like, I was about to say like, what made them decide to go check up on him? So, yeah, they found him, and it's not apparent murder. It seems to be a suicide, and I think Jughead is probably the only one that's going to be able to tell that it's not, because he'll probably read the suicide letter and be like, this doesn't sound like, Radberry. It's like, yeah, this isn't him, someone wrote, because obviously it makes sense why you also wouldn't make this an exact copy of what happened with, Ethel's parents, because either the whole point was to put it on Ethel in the first place, or, because that's the thing, like, too, like, hiding your methodology like that's interesting. Making the one, like, you're setting Ethel up for murder, but then making Radberry's death a suicide. Like, why not kill him the same way? Why change up your way of, your methodology of killing? So, I mean, it's only the second, and technically third murder because you killed both of Ethel's parents, but I'm like, that just seems weird. Once again, we don't know if, like, this is, like, really, like, a serial killer milkman. Is this just a thing of the time? Or is it a manifestation of something larger that's at play here in the Riverdale situation of, like, because of everything Tony's trying to help? Like, is it something evil manifesting itself as so is it kind of like an evil presence? Or is it just like it's just a regular serial killer in Riverdale? We'll ultimately have to wait to see, but like I said, I think Jughead's going to be the driving force behind finding out about Radberry's situation. Because we are nearing the halfway point of the season, so we haven't really dealt with, like, the bigger Riverdale stuff, like Tabitha, like, untangling everything. I don't know if that's going to be, like, a major staying into much later aspects of this season or what, because we've only touched on that on episode 1, and then we've got these murder things happening, sporadically throughout the season. But like I said, because the season's only 20 episodes, not say only, but the season's 20 episodes, so we, like I said, we are about to hit the halfway point. Next week's episode 9, so we're almost there. So I'm curious to see what ends up happening going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.